Good morning and welcome. This is the first Sunday after Easter, and Easter is the season which is given to storytelling. Stories of how the resurrection of Jesus continues to reverberate to this day. The good news that Christ is risen continues to shape the lives of his followers, the church, and indeed the world. It continues to shape and reshape our lives. It's the season for us to name our resurrection stories, the ways in which the risen Christ has come to us. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. This is the Reverend Judy Rigby from Airport West Uniting Church, and what follows is a selection of the material that I've prepared for the service this Sunday. As I begin, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, learn, work and worship, and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the commitment of the Uniting Church to work for reconciliation and justice. Hear the call to worship. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. God is alive. New birth is given. Hope is alive. A new age is dawning. Joy is alive. Redemption is here. Love is alive. Death cannot harm us. We are alive. New life is within us. The church is alive. God's Spirit is within us. God of life, we worship you. God of creation, we praise you. God of revelation, we learn from you. God of resurrection, we come to celebrate you. Our readings this morning include Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 35, Psalm 133, and John 20, 19 to 31. You might like to pause the video to look these up. I invite you to watch this visual representation of the gospel story today. It does have sound, but it's not in a recognisable language. We are invited to experience this story at a more feelings level as we watch.
Mathagnama. Magnisima kadashna kara mathagnama tha.
May napapansipuka. Laba, ejunga moriko.
Sa, dinil mathagnama.
Laba.
Malasanga maknatha.
Gradiga.
Magno.
Gwanda baby.
Maha? Maha? Sa.
Tenny.
Snugga matni. Dini ma snugga. In matni kavona. Dinisra. Kuretna asna pomata. Then I'm honest, do I? Lambda!
Onlara ringa bere. Oro. Mama.
I wonder what you noticed. Thomas's reliving of the crucifixion. Still, he has those images of trauma playing around in his head. The obvious fear of the disciples and what might happen if they ventured out from behind their locked doors. Locks plus plus plus. And that the door is still closed and locked 1 week after the first appearance of Jesus. I wonder what that is about. The disciple, Thomas the twin, has been dubbed throughout history as Doubting Thomas. But to single Thomas out as the doubting one seems to be seriously unfair. He was one of the doubting 11, no worse than the rest of them, and possibly a bit braver. He at least, it seems, had ventured out into the potential danger. And that's how he missed the first time Jesus appeared. And perhaps that's the real reason why he's singled out in John's account. Simply because he was the only one who hadn't been there the first time Jesus visited. And so in his story, we see the individual version of what all the others went through collectively. So I wonder about all that is not said in our gospel account today, about the space between the words, especially in the first verse of our reading, which begins, "That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders." And before I finish the verse, let's dwell in the space between those words and the next words for just a moment. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Let me now put the images and the space together. We've all experienced fear and now lockdown. Let us imagine or perhaps revisit that fear that prompts us to lock ourselves in. What is it like to live in that space? There's one frame in the video that tries to imagine it. I reckon that if you were to hear the individual accounts of any of the other disciples in that room, you'd get a somewhat similar story to that of Thomas. You'd hear about their grief, their fear and doubt, so paralysing that only the presence of the risen Christ, his message of peace, could break through it. In a sense then, perhaps you could say that Thomas's story is every disciple's story. That Thomas's story is your story and my story. It's our story. In today's Gospel account, we have 2 appearance stories. First to the disciples, minus Thomas, and then to the disciples with a focus on Thomas. We have noticed the locked door, the appearance of Jesus in their midst, and some versions stress the suddenness of that appearance. One moment he's not there and then he is there. The announcement of peace. Jesus showing his wounds to the disciples and then to Thomas specifically, addressing what we know was Thomas's stated needs: to see the mark of the nails in Jesus' hands, to put his finger into that mark and his hand into the wounded side. And Jesus responds, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Into the very human, physical and emotional responses that the disciples experienced, including Thomas, Jesus graces them, firstly with the gift of his presence and then the blessing of peace. Perhaps the greatest thing we can do for someone who is in a dark place is to pray for a sense of Christ's presence and for peace, to bring a blessing of peace. Certainly Jesus' presence and his words of peace changed the mood in that locked room. I invite you to pause for a moment and remember a time when you experienced this, the sudden sense of God's presence, the coming of peace where previously there had been no peace. These are resurrection stories. As for Thomas, Jesus does not reprimand him for his lack of faith. On the contrary, Jesus took seriously what Thomas had said he needed in order to believe. I imagine our video depiction is not too far off the mark. Thomas had to see Jesus before he could believe, because his head would have been so full of the images of the crucifixion and burial scenes. He needed to dispel those images of dying and death with the very real evidence of living flesh and blood. Although Jesus does appear to reproach Thomas for having to see before believing, saying that the disciples who would yet come would believe without seeing, his actions demonstrated something else. He gave Thomas what he needed to help him believe. This is not a story of judgment and reprimand, but of hope and promise. It is a commissioning story. And so we are commissioned to live into and out of our own sense of resurrection. The last year has seen us living behind our own locked doors. It has highlighted our vulnerabilities and sharpened our fears. I hear in myself a slowness to reopen the door for fear of it being slammed shut again. And I know at the moment I carry a heaviness of heart over other doors that now seem to be forever locked and keys thrown away. Janet Morley, in her poem about the woman at the tomb entitled "I Never Meant You to Roll Back the Stone," describes this fear, how the women were acquainted with their grief, familiar with its despair, how resurrection rudely announced its irrelevance to those first disciples when they were not yet ready to let go of fear and grief. So if we know that feeling, that we're not ready to let go of fear, of grief, of staying behind locked doors, then we are in good company. But the invitation is to hear again the blessing of the risen Christ. Peace be with you. To unlock our locked doors, to step out even into uncertain spaces, to choose life, to choose to believe, and to choose to follow the risen Christ. Bruce Brewer has written this affirmation of faith entitled We Believe. And I invite you to respond with me as we hear the affirmation of faith. Faith demands choice. By the grace of Christ, we can choose. We choose to believe that light is better than darkness. Sharing is better than hoarding. Truth is better than deceit. Mercy is better than revenge. Love is better than indifference. And God is stronger than chaos. We choose to have faith in the God who is love, and choice will verify itself on the long and narrow road of life. By grace, we choose to choose faith. Thanks be to God. Amen.